Now, Navalny's treatment has sparked calls for mass protests this week in cities across Russia, with his supporters demanding that the 44-year-old is indeed released. We've just had a statement from police warning Russians against participating in these protests throughout the week. And to understand the situation better, let's cross now to Moscow, where Tanya Lokshina is standing by. She's the Europe and Central Asia Associate Director at Human Rights Watch. Thank you so much for being with us this Monday. Can you tell us whatever information you have at this stage on the state of health of Navalny?
Look, unfortunately, we do not have access to the penal colony in Pokrov, where Mr. Navalny is being held. Therefore, the kind of information we've got comes from his team, comes from his family, and comes from the press. So I know pretty much, I know as much as you do. The situation is utterly outrageous. Mr. Navalny alleged last year that he was poisoned with the Novichok nerve agent, that is an internationally banned weapon, and he said specifically that the Federal Security Service was behind his poisoning. He also presented rather weighty evidence. Now, the best proof that the Kremlin really had nothing to do with it would be for the Kremlin to actually investigate his allegations and find out what exactly happened. Instead of doing that, the authorities lock Mr. Navalny up as soon as he returns to Russia.
Absolutely,
from Germany.
and Tanya Lokshina, I want to bring
Now,
the story back to.
possibly-
I want to bring the story back to what we're hearing today. My big question to you now is, because according to Russian reports, we're hearing that Navalny is to be hospitalized. For you, for Human Rights Watch, is that a first step?
Well, it is definitely the first step. He desperately needed medical attention, and frankly, given his mockery of a trial and given the way the government locked him up for clearly political reasons, he could not possibly trust the prison doctors. Now, the news about Mr. Navalny getting hospitalized gives us some sign of hope.
So some
But
sign of
he
hope
does
there.
not belong behind us.
Absolutely, some sign of hope. And as I mentioned earlier, protesters still wanting to take to the streets this week to declare their support. Statement coming from Russian police saying don't take to the streets. Does that mean that we should be expecting more violence, more human rights violations at the hands of the Russians throughout the week? Briefly, if you can, Tanya Lokshina.
Well, most unfortunately, we are really worried that many of those who take to the streets on Wednesday in support of Alexei Navalny would be arbitrarily detained and would face administrative arrests and other sanctions. For that matter, in January, when people rallied up across the country, not only to support Navalny, but also to protest corruption and lawlessness, there were record numbers of detentions, including in Moscow, but also in different cities of Russia. And many of those people then were slapped with administrative arrest and prohibitive fines. Administrative arrest facilities in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in other places in Russia were full to overflowing, and the conditions there were absolutely appalling.
Absolutely, and I'm afraid, Tanya Lokshina, we're gonna have to wrap that up. We are expecting, as you mentioned, more arbitrary arrests potentially this week. Tanya Lokshina of Human Rights Watch, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us here on France 24.